Hey guys, it's Danny. Hope you all had a great weekend. Today, we're gonna talk about repotting orchids, specifically my 10 tips for making a repotting easier and a lot better for your orchid and even for yourself. Now, here on my channel, we did countless repottings from Phalaenopsis to Cattleyas, and more recently, we repotted 10 Oncidiums in one video. So I'll link you down below in the description to some examples of repottings, but as we know, each repotting is just a little bit different. So today I thought I could put together 10 super easy tips that I believe will help you no matter what orchid you're repotting. And since repotting can put a lot of stress on our orchid, it is in our best interest to make a good repotting. So with that said, I think it is time to start with the very beginning, and this is choosing the appropriate sized pot. At first, this sounds easy enough. We need to choose a pot which is not way too big or way too tiny for our orchid. But how do we determine which pot is suited for our particular orchid? As some of you might know, many articles and other tutorials suggest that you go by the amount of roots the orchid has. And that's not necessarily something bad to go by, but it's very incomplete, and if you follow it blindly, you will end up stressing your orchid even more. What you need to do is choose a pot that fits your entire orchid, not only the root system or only the foliage, but everything. So first off, do choose a pot that can fit the entirety of the roots your orchid has. However, make sure the roots are not very snug. Sometimes you will be able to fit your orchid in its original pot, but if you look closely, you will see that other roots will not actually have enough space to grow. And theoretically, we should keep the orchid in its new pot for at least 2 years from this moment onwards. So instead of making sure the roots actually fit, make sure that potential new roots will fit as well. Try to imagine that your orchid generally will produce at least half the size of the root system it already has. Also, if your orchid has numerous pseudobulbs, we need to account for the space they will take in the pot. And again, we need to make sure that there is enough space in the pot for 2 years worth of growth. Most orchids will produce 1 to maximum 2 new pseudobulbs per year. So look at the pseudobulbs and see how much space they're taking up, and imagine you will need to provide at least room for another 1 or 2 of these pseudobulbs. Basing your decision solely on the root system will absolutely end in disaster if you have an orchid which does not have too many roots or no roots at all. You can actually have a very bushy orchid without any roots, which will obviously fit in a very tiny pot, but if treated correctly, in a few months, it will completely take over the pot. So you will need to repot again, and you will have to stress to some degree the orchid once again. Also, some orchids have very thick roots, so obviously they will take more space in the pot. So do pay attention to all of these aspects of your orchid, and it will become intuitive at some point what size of a pot you should use with your orchid. Trust me, it is very important to choose an appropriate sized pot, and many times we go with smaller pots than we should. Now, this strategy arose from the fact that people were using very big pots for very tiny orchids, and a lot of water was unused in the pot. But don't worry, even if your orchid does not have enough roots just yet, just pipe down on your watering, or make sure that all of the water is drained from the pot, or just don't use very water retentive materials. Or even if you do use such materials like sphagnum moss, just don't saturate it. You don't have to. You can just add a small quantity of water to sphagnum moss. With bark, it's a non-issue because you can just run water through the bark, drain it very well, and you won't have excessive water. So do take into account your entire orchid when you're choosing the size of your pot, and you will thank yourself later. Tip number 2. Water your orchid 1 or 2 days before you plan to repot it. This has multiple benefits actually. First of all, it will make sure that your orchid is properly hydrated when you repot it. This will make the whole procedure a lot easier on the orchid, and the after effects will not be so bad. Roots take a little bit to get adjusted to the medium and to the move. If they are in very good condition and you didn't damage them, they can take off after a few days. But it has been my experience that orchids which were not watered before repotting got a little bit more dehydrated than the ones which were recently watered. So what I usually do with any repotting is make sure that I do water my orchids very well before repotting, usually 24 hours before or 48 hours before. This, of course, applies to orchids which have roots. If your orchid is rootless, of course, this little tip will not make any difference. However, any root you can save on your orchid will make a difference, so why take the risk? A second benefit to watering prior to repotting is that it will make the roots a lot more flexible, the medium will be removed from the roots a lot faster, and even the orchid will actually get removed from its pot a lot easier than if it were dry, particularly useful for clay pots, but it will be useful in plastic as well. So if the orchid you want to repot is in bark, make sure that you soak it for 10 to 15 minutes and then wait another day for the roots to become very flexible. If your orchid is in moss, just make sure you saturate the moss properly. A repotting will go much easier with super wet moss. Not to mention, your orchid will be very hydrated and prepared to handle the stress of repotting. Rinse the root system of orchids with water at the sink if your water is suitable for orchids, or in a different bowl if your water is absolutely not suitable at all. Don't be afraid that you might lose potential beneficial bacteria or microorganisms. This is a very old idea which hasn't really been proven and has just been dismissed nowadays, while the benefits of actually rinsing the root system properly have been shown time and time again. So even if the medium is wet and you're doing a proper job in removing all of the old medium from the root system, rinsing the root system will remove even the tiny debris that your hands cannot really grab. Sometimes you can get rid even of pests, and even if you won't get rid of all the potential pest infestation, you will definitely decrease the number of pests you have left on the roots, and that always helps. Tip number 4, when cutting dead roots, it's always a great idea to go to the oldest parts of the orchid. In the case of Phalaenopsis orchids and other monopodials, we don't necessarily have an old part of the orchid, but we do have a stem. So if you go at the very bottom of the stem or the axis, you will find the oldest roots. Chances are the majority of dead roots are there. In the case of sympodial orchids such as oncidiums, dendrobiums, cattleyas, and others, go to the oldest pseudobulbs and inspect the roots there. Chances are those are where the vast majority of the dead roots are coming from. This tip is especially useful if you have an orchid with an abundance of roots, and it will take you forever to check each and every root to see which one is alive, which one is dead. In the vast majority of cases, the oldest roots are the ones most affected or the ones that have already gone. And those old roots are always on the oldest parts of the orchid. We are halfway through our tip list with tip number 5. If case will require it, you can divide your orchid and rearrange it to better fit your pot. Now, this is a tip which solely refers to sympodial orchids, which have pseudobulbs or fans or other structures connected through a rhizome. I am not talking about Phalaenopsis or Vandas here. Sometimes you just have those orchids which seem to grow only from the sides. In my example, this Cattleya orchid has a direction of growth here, so it will continue to grow on this side. It has one here, another one will be here. It's just not big enough yet. There's another one in the back, but I think we can see the problem here. If this growth pattern continues, the orchid will spill out of the pot. While in the center, there's room for an entire family, and nobody uses that space. What I can do when I repot this orchid is split it in divisions. I can repot those divisions together in the same pot, but I can rearrange their position so that the new growth and the direction of growth faces more towards the center of the pot. This will extend the time that my orchid can spend in this pot, and it will result in pushing away the date of the next repotting, therefore not stressing the orchid too often. If we let the growth just spill out of their pot, they will create roots outside of the pot, and while that is not a problem with epiphytic orchids, you might actually have a problem in maintaining the orchid hydrated. Also, the new roots are the ones that are most vigorous, and they will absorb nutrients and water the best out of the entire root system. So just letting them dangle outside of the pot, not watering them, not fertilizing them, is just a waste of potential energy gained by the orchid. Reshaping the orchid fixes all of that, and you don't have to give up any part of the orchid. You can still grow a specimen orchid, and the fact that they will all just be divisions, well, it's just gonna be our little secret. Tip number 6, placing medium inside the root ball to avoid a very big air pocket. Now, for most repottings, we will not necessarily need to do this because not all orchids have a big and impressive root system. So usually we won't have issues arranging the medium around the root system, but sometimes some orchids just have a lot of roots. And when we repot them, the inside of the root ball will be hollow. This is not a bad thing for an epiphytic orchid. It can be a bad thing for you because the pot might dry out faster than you'd like. So when you repot the orchid, you can actually arrange some medium inside the root ball, and when you have all the medium you want inside the center of the root system, you can gently tip the orchid over and place it inside the pot. And then you can simply put medium around the root system because you already know that in the center there is something there to retain moisture. Tip number 7, arrange the orchid in the pot for optimal new growth space. When you're dealing with Phalaenopsis orchids and their hybrids or Vanda orchids, if you choose to pot them, you can place the orchid smack in the middle of the pot and everything should be okay, because the direction of growth of these orchids is upwards or to the side. But you get what I mean. They have a central axis and new leaves will always come from here. Basal keikis are rare, and even if they happen, they don't take up a lot of space. So with monopodial orchids and even Paphiopedilum orchids, which have very short rhizomes, things are pretty easy. But when it comes to sympodial orchids such as Oncidiums, Cattleyas, and many others, it is not a good idea to actually center the orchid in the pot. What you need to do is find the oldest growth on the orchid and push that to the side and place the newest growth of the orchid towards the center of the pot, because this is where a new growth will sprout, and you want to have a lot of real estate here for its roots to properly go inside the medium and for the growth to develop on top of the medium. Here's a little tip on finding the latest growth. Typically, the flowers are always produced on new growth. So look for remains of a flower spike, or if you have flowers on your orchid, then the structure creating those flowers is typically the newest one. And usually with new orchids, the biggest pseudobulb is the latest one created. And the tiniest pseudobulb typically is a seedling pseudobulb. This is the oldest growth. So when placing this orchid in the pot, make sure the oldest growth is placed towards the side of the pot and the latest growth towards the center, because this is where a new growth will start and it will take that much space in the pot. Imagine if this pseudobulb will be placed towards the side of the pot. The new growth will just spill outside of the pot, and that's not something we want, especially with Oncidiums. Tip number 8, don't create very big air pockets in your medium. Now, for most epiphytic orchids, small air pockets are absolutely fine. In fact, they make sure that the root system is aerated enough. The problem is when these air pockets are very, very big, because in that space you won't have enough moisture. And if you're dealing with a terrestrial orchid or an orchid which simply likes to stay rather moist, then it's in your best interest not to have super big air pockets. When you're dealing with bark medium or other media which contains rigid pieces of materials, you can just tap on the pot, you can squeeze it, you can lightly press on it, and typically these particles of medium will just fall into place. But when you're using sphagnum moss or a combination of bark and sphagnum moss, things are a lot different, because moss is just too flexible and too stringy to fall into place. So what you can do is find yourself a bamboo skewer, go to the big air pocket you want to fix, and simply squeeze a little bit on the pot. Insert the bamboo skewer on the side of the pot just so you see where it goes and that you don't actually poke any root, and start to wiggle it around, maybe push back the sphagnum moss and gently the roots so you create space for the bark to fall into place. As I was saying, bark falls into place. The problem is the moss. So go around the entire sides of the pot and do this maneuver, and you will see that the bigger pockets will be filled. With bark and moss mixes, it's useless to try to tap on the pot or squeeze it, or worse, press on the top of the pot. It will not do anything, but the skewer trick works every time. Just be careful that you don't damage the roots. Second to last tip, tip number 9, stake your orchid for more stability. When we repot orchids, the roots simply get unanchored, and many of the times the orchid will become wobbly in its pot. Also, if we're dealing with an orchid which doesn't have enough roots, it's inevitable that the orchid will wobble. In sphagnum moss, things are not so severe, but in bark mixes, orchids can be very unstable. Inserting a temporary bamboo skewer or a different stake if you'd like will solve the issue. I like to stake the sturdiest pseudobulb right where the leaves are produced on top of the new cane. But if the orchid had a flower spike, I can use it as an anchoring point even if it's dry and it doesn't have flowers anymore. The orchid will be a lot more stable in its pot. And that's very important because you don't want the new root tips to be bruised or damaged in any way. Sometimes you can even use rhizome clips, which you can buy from orchid nurseries or garden centers. An unstable orchid will take longer to establish, and as I was saying, the new root tips are very, very important, so we need to protect them by maintaining the orchid stable in its pot. And I just don't feel comfortable with compacting the medium until it becomes suffocating. I'd rather use stakes. They're not permanent, they're very temporary, and they don't pose any threat to the root system. And lastly, tip number 10, after repotting, always water your orchid. Yes, I know there are again a lot of articles suggesting that you let the orchid just dry out for a week or even 2, which I don't suggest you leave your orchids unwatered for 2 weeks. This again is one of those very old advice that every one of us read at some point in our orchid journey, which in our experience turned out not to be all that useful. Fresh new medium, especially bark, will always have particles of dust or just of bark. In transportation or just by sitting, this medium will shed. Now these particles can be slightly desiccant depending what they are. So with very sensitive rooted orchids, these particles of dust can actually be harmful. This of course will not happen to things like Phalaenopsis and other very strong rooted orchids, but there are orchids which simply do not like drought, such as Miltoniopsis or other orchids, and leaving them unwatered will seriously stress them out. And with something like Miltoniopsis, you just don't want to do that. Also, it has been my experience that if I maintain an orchid very well watered after repotting, I simply skip the whole dehydration issue. Many orchids will get just a little bit dehydrated after repotting despite having a good root system because they're taking a lot of time to adjust to a new environment. They're taking their time to start anchoring their roots again, and that will just take up energy from the plant and more resources spent. So I want to make sure that water is always present so that the orchid doesn't overly dehydrate after this process. I'm not saying you should keep the orchid medium soggy. The orchid medium should always be very well ventilated and well draining, but definitely I would not advise you to maintain it dry. In my experience, the effect of me watering the pot has never ever been dramatic. I took great care that I was gentle on the roots, and I also removed all of the dead and unhealthy roots from the get-go. So I never had dead roots after a good repotting. There are many reasons why I find not watering orchids after repotting simply wrong and unfounded. So I will not recommend you guys not to water your orchid after repotting. And that's about it for today's video. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you found this useful. And you know the drill, like or dislike this video below, subscribe to my channel for regular orchid videos, tutorials, Q&As, and other fun orchid subjects. And if you'd like to support the channel, do consider visiting the merch store. You have links down below in the description. With that said, I'll see you guys next time. Bye!